The image you're viewing on screen now is part of my fine art light painting collection. Hi, I'm Richard from Nightscape Images. I get a lot of comments and questions about my light painted images, such as the beautiful old ute we've just been looking at here. So I thought I'd put together a video showing a general overview of how I achieve the look of these particular images. The main difference between these images and my standard nightscapes is that I use a combination of multiple layers combined with focus stacking techniques. The reason for this is to create images that exhibit very high definition and low noise, as well as the obvious advantage of having all segments of the image in crisp focus. Night photography can be a very daunting exercise, and it's never easy to capture the perfect image. Low ambient light combined with very narrow apertures and high ISOs generally leads to a lot of noise, out of focus shots. It's quite obvious that the more you open up the aperture of the lens, the narrower the plane of focus. We use this principle to our advantage when looking for that wonderful out of focus background shot, drawing our attention to the main subject matter of the image. And the opposite principle applies when we take expansive landscape shots where we close down the aperture and get a lovely all-in focus image. It's the classic catch-22 situation. At night, when capturing Milky Way images, wide apertures such as f2.8 are required to gather as much light into the camera sensor as we can, but we can't have our shutter open too long as the stars begin to streak. This has led to a mindset amongst night photographers to compromise on some aspects of our shooting. Either we put up with out of focus areas in our photos, or we close down our apertures to try and get more in focus, which leads to a longer shutter duration, resulting in stars that are not pinpoints, but rather streaks. The only other solution is to raise the ISO to ridiculous levels, which results in lots of noisy images. So, when working out solutions to these issues, I've worked hard on the principles of layering multiple images and blending these together into a final composite shot, with everything well lit and in good focus. Using the example of our old ute, I'll show you some of the steps involved in creating a final image. This shot is comprised of a total of 12 images. I always start with the background layer to capture the sky, and this follows my usual method of focusing on infinity and exposing for the ambient conditions. In this case, using a 20mm focal length lens, the settings were 20-second exposure, an aperture of f2.5 with an ISO of 2000. The other thing I usually do with night sky shots is to set the white balance somewhere between 3400 and 4000 K, depending on conditions at the time, such as light pollution or if there's any moon present. Of course, during all these exposures, the camera is firmly mounted on a tripod, and this is the most important thing to remember, as it becomes very difficult to align the various layers if there is any movement of the camera between shots. Once the background ambient layer is captured, I get to work on light painting the foreground subject, in this case the old ute. One important thing to remember here, however, is that before I start to capture these next images, I'll do a couple of very important things. Firstly, I'll change the aperture of the lens. In this case, I set the aperture to f5.6. Then I'll change the ISO settings. So in this one, I set it to ISO 500. I may also change the white balance depending on what I'm shooting, and most importantly, what light source I'm using to paint the subject. In this example, I set the white balance on 4000 K, as the old ute was a very rusty yellow tone anyway, so there was no need to increase the colour temperature anymore. The reason I changed the aperture to f5.6 was to ensure more of the ute was in focus. This will also have the added advantage of a sharper image, as most lenses are much better when stopped down a bit. So, as you may have guessed by now, I've changed the focus of the lens from the background infinity setting to the actual foreground subject. This is a small change, but in the final output gives us a beautifully crisp image. The only other thing to do now is work out the shutter speed. In this case, I left it at 20 seconds for each exposure, but sometimes I'll need longer than that to give me time to light the image the way I need to. Because we are not using any of the background in our shots now, I can have any length of shutter duration. No star trailing to worry about, as we lowered the ISO to 500. A lot more light will need to be painted on the subject to achieve the same level of exposure. The ISO is lowered to reduce noise in the image. Remember, the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image will be. So far it's been a fairly technical process, but now the creative juices can kick in as we begin to light the subject from different angles and intensities to achieve a pleasing image. My personal preference is to provide as much lighting from behind the subject as possible. This gives us some lovely shadow perspective. I personally avoid lighting from the same angle as the camera, as I feel this gives a dull, lifeless and flat image. How many images you shoot at this stage doesn't really matter. The key is to make sure each part of the subject has been lit and will be visible in the final blended image. For example, this image was created from 5 separate exposures. This mower was also created from 5 images. This image of the cameras used 3 separate exposures. And this lovely Milky Way shot used only 2, one for the sky and one for the grain silo. As an alternate to these, this old mine scene was created from around 20 separate exposures. It all depends on what each situation requires. As a general rule, the least amount of individual shots, the better, as it'll be quicker edit in post-production. So, speaking of post-production, I'd like to run you through the process involved in blending and layering these images together. I'll be using a combination of Lightroom and Photoshop to do this. So, let's have a look. Okay, well here we are in Lightroom and I've opened up the images already. There's about 12 or 13 of them down the bottom here. You can see the image I have highlighted currently is the background layer. So this is focused on the stars and the background. So there's trees and all of that background area is in focus. Now you can see the adjustments I have made on this image. There's not much. I've lowered the highlights, I've raised the whites and a bit of clarity. If you scroll down further in this develop module, you'll see not much else except that I've adjusted the noise reduction a little bit and enabled profile corrections down here. And you can see I haven't adjusted the white balance. That's pretty much where it was shot. If you look at the before and after, there it is there. This is before shot, the after shot. A little bit more intensity and a little bit more brightness in the image, but that's about it. Now these are very normal settings for me for my night photography sky shots. Now the other ones down the bottom here are the layers that I have created with light painting, and you can see there's various aspects of the car have been lit. You can see those there, just little bits, and I'm going to show you in a minute what that looks like when I import that into Photoshop. So what I'm going to do now is actually do that. So to do that, I'm going to highlight the images that I want to import into Photoshop, like this, just one at a time, like that, and that's the background layer there. Right click on one of those images, edit in up here. It gives me plenty of options over there next to it. All of these options here, the one I want is to open as layers in Photoshop. So we're going to do that now, and then it takes a little while for Photoshop to open. So what we're going to do is wait for that. And here it is. Now you can see this is the final blended layer in Photoshop. Now all of these here are the ones I brought in. There's a couple there I didn't bother using, so you can see that they're actually turned off, those layers. Now what I've done here is I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I've basically put the background layer on the bottom. So the background layer is on the bottom, all the other layers are above that. And what I've done is I've attached layer masks to all of these other ones. The reason I've attached a layer mask is because if I want to rub out areas of the image, which I need to get rid of the sky out of all of those images except the bottom one, then the easiest way to do it is to create a layer mask and then go over here and use the brush tool and just rub it out. And that's why I've done that. Now if I turn all of these off, I'll just show you what the image looks like when I add the layers one by one. So here we go down like so, starting with the background layer, and that's the same as the one I just showed you in Lightroom, and I'm just adding these one at a time. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and there's 10. The other thing you'll notice is I have actually used a lighten blend mode here in all of these layers except the bottom one. You don't have to do that necessarily, but what that does is it enables the software to see the lighter parts of the image to show through from underneath. It's typically what I do for star trail images as well, and Photoshop is fantastic. There's always more than one way to go about doing the same thing, and so I've basically incorporated two areas here: lighten blend mode and layer masking. There's a lot of other things you can do in Photoshop, but I haven't done that because I don't need to. So in a very, very, very brief summary, that's how I've created this image in Photoshop. And I won't go through how I've masked out all of these things because that's a little bit laborious and tedious. But suffice to say, what I've done is I've selected the layer, for example this one here, got the tool here and just scrubbed out the background. So if I actually turn off these other layers, the bottom layer, you can see the background, the sky has been rubbed out, and various other little bits and pieces around some of the images. And different images have different parts of the image that's been rubbed out, like so. And that's how it looks. And when you include the bottom layer, because all of these top layers have got transparency, you can see through right through to the bottom layer, and there it is. And that's our final composite image. Now, to complete this process, all we do is press the cross at the top right hand corner here, save changes to document, press yes, and away we go, and that takes us back to where we started in Lightroom with a completed image, and there it is there. Now from there I can export that out and do whatever I wish with it. So in a very, very, very brief explanation, that's how I create these composite layers. You will notice that all of these layers, when I come in close to them, you can see how sharp the detail is on this car, and even the grass at the front here is sharp. Bits at the back of the car are still sharp. The trees here, except the wind was blowing that night a little bit, quite sharp. You can see Mount Macedon there in the background, sharp. So that's the advantage of using this method of layering and masking, and it does give you some great opportunities to create some really dynamic and eye-catching blended images. Impossible to get this in a single exposure because, as I've previously mentioned, the focus on the car and the sky have to be different because of the focal length. This is a 20mm focal length lens. You could use a wider lens such as a 14 or a 16mm lens. You would still have focus issues if you zoomed in close. So there you have it in a nutshell. That's how we blend the images together. So in summary, create a background layer. Change the aperture, ISO, shutter speed for foreground subject layers. Light paint the subject and remember to use lots of angles. Import images into Lightroom and process each one to taste. Open all images in Photoshop and blend layers to suit desired outcome. Export final composition from Photoshop back to Lightroom as a single flattened image. Okay, well that's the process I use to create my fine art light painted images. Thanks so much for taking the time to check out this video, and I really value your encouragement and support. Don't forget, I'm always happy to chat about any of these processes if you're not sure of anything. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.